podium today, and I would like just to give, before I introduce our today's speaker, just a short introduction. As you know, our nuclear engineering department won another 5 years from Department of Energy and NSSC for nuclear science and security. And as part of our new consortium, we now have 8 university collaborating team, and we have 5 national laboratories that we collaborate with. And in terms of our laboratory collaborators, we have Lawrence Berkeley, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia National Laboratories. There are 2, one here at Livermore, the other one at Albuquerque, New Mexico, Los Alamos, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So our goal is for students, particularly students that are NSSC fellows, to match them with our colleagues from national laboratories, because one of the requirements is that our NSSC fellows do have, in addition to their academic advisor, they do need to have research advisor in one of national laboratories. So we will be inviting our colleagues from all of these 5 laboratories over the next several months. And our first guest from Sandia National Laboratories is our today's guest, Sheryl, if I'm pronouncing correctly, Hingorani. Okay. So she will be talking about nuclear policy activities in Sandia National Laboratories. So this will be from 4 to 5. And then after that, we will have focus group discussion. So you are all invited to stay and to have additional questions and additional discussion. So I will introduce Sheryl. So she leads Sandia's System Analysis and Engineering Organization, Livermore, California. She started her career at Sandia in 1986, almost at the same time when I started my PhD studies at University of Michigan, 1985.
I just got my 30-year service award at Sandia.
Yes. As a mechanical design engineer, and has spent most of her career working in a variety of positions at Sandia Nuclear Weapons Program, including as Sandia Nuclear Weapons Chief of Staff, and as chair of the independent red team for the annual assessment of the state of health of the U.S. nuclear stockpile. She received a special appointment to distinguished member of technical staff at Sandia in 1998 and moved into management. Are you happy with the management positions? In 2004. I was the chair of the department for 4 years, and when Dean asked me if I would continue, I said, thank you very much. I had my share of management experience. So she completed studies as a fellow with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Center for International Studies and was the recipient of the Leadership Foundation Fellowship from the International Women's Forum. Between 2000 and 2005, she was executive director of the Albuquerque Committee on Foreign Relationships and also served as secretary for the American Committee on Foreign Relations for 2 years. She is a laboratory advisor to the Defense Science Board Special Task Force on Weapons of Mass Destruction, and is a laboratory affiliate to the California Council on Science and Technology. And she is also a member of the Society of Women Engineers.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that was not necessarily a good use of your time to listen to all of that, but thank you very much. So I'm really happy to be here, and I want it to be beneficial to you. So I prepared some materials that I'll start to walk you through, but I hope that you'll stop me, ask questions. If we have time in the second hour, you know, we can talk more, but please interrupt me, just raise your hand. I knew this was going to happen. Okay, here we go. So here's what I was going to cover today. I want to give you an overview of Sandia Labs because in case you're considering reaching out to Sandia as a place where you might want to recruit a special advisor or mentor or a project. And then I want to talk about how I think about global nuclear security and stability. So I've created sort of my own framework or construct for that. So Sandia is a national security lab. So everything I'm going to talk about is really about national security related or global security related. There are other labs that are, you know, Department of Energy labs that are more energy research and so on, but my talk will have a national security focus. And then my understanding is that there's a focus area associated with policy focus area. And so what I brought is some examples of things that the labs are doing. So the labs are known for our technical breadth and depth, but technology can inform policy decisions. It can enable the implementation of policy decisions. And so we do work at the intersection between technology and policy. And I brought examples of policy-related activities. That's my understanding of one of the purposes of this forum. And then we'll just have some discussion. So let's see if I know what I'm doing. So long time ago, in the United States, we have, and I'm sure you're aware of, the Manhattan Project. And during that era in time, we spun off the engineering arm. So a nuclear weapon requires a nuclear explosive device, but then it also requires all of the engineering, all of the safety and security features, all of the components for arming and firing a weapon. And so that engineering arm was spun off as a separate organization called Sandia National Laboratories. And at that time, President Truman asked AT&T Bell Laboratories to manage Sandia, and he used this term, you have the opportunity to render exceptional service in the national interest. And so that's really become our slogan or our motto at Sandia. Exceptional service in the national interest. And then in 1956, we established a second Sandia Lab site in Livermore, California, across the street from Lawrence Livermore Labs. And so we just had our 60-year anniversary this year. And the mission of the labs has changed over the decades, and it's changed in response to national security needs. So I won't go over this with you in detail, but basically in the beginning, we were 100% focused on the nuclear weapons mission and the nuclear deterrence mission, and that was the primary national concern for the United States of America in that era. And then as the decades went by, other national security concerns emerged, and we were able to take the breadth and depth of the scientific and engineering capabilities of the labs and apply them to new engineering challenges. So for example, during the 1970s, as you know, there was a big energy crisis in the United States, and we had some very specialized understanding of sort of geosciences because we had been doing underground nuclear tests that we could apply to things like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as an example. There are many, many examples like this. And then without going through all the details, today Sandia is a $3 billion annual institution, and just over half of our revenue is focused on the nuclear weapons mission. The other half is spread across a wide variety of other national security missions. So this is the graphic we use. I don't want to apologize for it because I didn't create it, but it's not all that awesome, but it does, it's intended to indicate that nuclear weapons is our core mission, that we have other missions like global nuclear assurance and security, cybersecurity. We do about $700 million of work for the Department of Defense that we call synergistic defense programs. those are missions where the work is so synergistic that we can't actually untangle the work. You know, that we couldn't revert back to a purely nuclear weapons lab because we have so much synergy with our other missions, and those other missions actually exercise critical capabilities for our core mission. And then we have another set of missions there at the top: chem biodangers, a secure and sustainable energy future, and some of the work we do on space assets and systems that are also resting on those underpinning capabilities that are required for the nuclear weapons mission. So this is the graphic that we use. I'm sure if you went to the sandia.gov website, you would be able to find this. And then, you know, the strength of Sandia and the other labs is that we have this broad, multidisciplinary science and engineering research base. And so these are our research foundations. I won't read them to you, but across all the national laboratories, you would see a similar set of, you know, deep scientific underpinnings for the work that we do. You know, I'll bring this up again later, but in nuclear weapons, we use this phrase, always never, that nuclear weapons must always work when commanded and authorized by the President of the United States, and they must never work under any other circumstances. And that is a big engineering challenge. And it's not something, requires a lot of margin, a lot of redundancy, a lot of deep scientific understanding of your design. And so all of this is underpinning our mission space. Let me say one more thing about research, which you may not know. There's something called Laboratory Directed Research and Development, or the acronym is LDRD. And so Congress actually allows the national laboratories to tax all the mission-related revenue that comes into the labs and use that 6 to 8%, because Congress changes the number sometimes, but roughly 6 to 8%, use that money to do laboratory-directed research and development. And so oftentimes our new hires, some of our postdocs, they're working on those LDRD programs. It's, you know, it's become a somewhat bureaucratic machine, meaning there's a proposal process, there are calls in specific areas, so it's still very competitive, but it is a luxury that we have to have, you know, a big chunk of funding that we can use for laboratory-directed research and development. Now, in Livermore, I wanted to just sort of orient you to the workforce that we have in Livermore, California. We have over 10,000 people at our primary location, which is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then we have approximately 1,300 people in Livermore. 800 or so, you know, a little over half are what we consider R&D staff. So these are the technical staff that work at the labs. And what you can see there is all of the variety of other support fields. And then on the right, that pie chart on the right is intended to convey that we are really an engineering lab. I mean, we have scientists, but we consider ourselves to be sort of an engineering lab with the engineering arm of, for example, the nuclear weapons mission. We also have over 64 nationals working on site, and this is actually remarkable because we do a lot of highly classified work. The vast majority of our work is classified, but we are able to take and physically locate, for example, some of our energy research, some of our biofuels research, some of our unclassified work in a separate area, so we are able to make use of the talent that we have, even if they're non-US citizens. Okay, so that was my Sandia overview. I'm going to shift to this construct for global nuclear security and stability. And I'll just preface this by saying, when I spent 28 years at the Albuquerque location for Sandia, and then I've been here for 2 years. When I moved out here 2 years ago, I brought with me part of my nuclear weapons leadership portfolio that had to do with the emerging threats, which we can talk a little bit about. But I also had a new job, which was supporting the Department of Homeland Security. They have a sub-organization called the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. And I think you know that after 9/11, after the attacks of 9/11, we created a Department of Homeland Security and basically merged a number of organizations into that new department. The Secret Service, Customs and Borders Protection, the TSA, and so on and so forth. So this is a relatively young organization, 10 to 15 years on government scales, but the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office is about preventing nuclear terrorism. And so for a couple of years, I was working in both of these areas of nuclear deterrence and also preventing nuclear terrorism. And what I saw is a lot of common needs, a lot of common objectives. And so this construct just says, this is what my way of thinking about it, people can view it other ways as well, that, one of the elements of global nuclear security and stability is that the U.S. has to demonstrate commitment and leadership in terms of non-proliferation and arms control, right? We're signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we have an obligation to show that leadership. We also, on the right-hand side, I think an important element of this is preventing both unauthorized access or use of nuclear materials, devices, and weapons, and also on the bottom right there, preventing nuclear accidents. So there's intentional but unauthorized use, and then, of course, there are accidents. And there are a lot of common approaches associated, for example, with remediation or crisis management and those kinds of things. I actually brought a few copies. I think I brought 10 copies of this 2-page document that describes this in more detail than I have time for today. And then on the upper left there, deterring attack, strategic attack on the U.S. or our interests abroad or our allies, that's an important part of global nuclear security and stability. And paradoxically, we also have to have the ability to effectively employ nuclear weapons if deterrence fails and restore deterrence. I mean, basically that's you can't deter with a nuclear capability that you're not willing to employ if deterrence fails and if your objective is to end the conflict and restore deterrence. So this is a model that, it has a lot of implications for policy space, and we'll talk through. I'm not going to use this as an organizing construct for the rest of the slides, but I will refer back to this from time to time.
Could you clarify your use of the word strategic? What do you mean by strategic?
Well, in my original version of this, I said deter nuclear attack. But in the most recent nuclear posture review, which is what I'm going to speak about next, there was, which was several years ago, 8 years ago, there was some discussion about using the term the sole purpose of nuclear weapons being to deter nuclear attack, and that ended up not being in the final version. The final version says something like primary role or something like that, and it leaves open the option of a nuclear response to an existential threat that is not nuclear. An existential threat against the United States of America.
That makes sense.
Right.
You're explicitly excluding non-state actors and non-strategic use. This is about state actors. Is that correct?
This is about state actors. However, this is about strategic conflict and state actors. However, we don't have disputed territory on our borders. We don't have expansionist aims. We don't have the Senkaku Islands or the Taiwan or, and so on. But we have nuclear umbrella commitments to allies who are in those regional conflict, areas with nuclear powers like China and Russia. And so even though our primary focus for U.S. nuclear deterrence is on strategic deterrence. We also maintain a very small portion of the U.S. nuclear stockpile, which we consider non-strategic because it's not covered by the START Treaty and the New START Treaty, which is Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And we really only have those as assurance for our allies, not for our own strategic deterrence needs. Is that? Oh, okay. Any other questions on this? Okay. So in 2010, the Nuclear Posture Review came out, and I can give a whole talk about this because it was total genius in my view. But basically, the Nuclear Posture Review of 2010, there were a few others previously, I think 3 maybe previous nuclear posture reviews. You can find this on the internet. Frankly, it's an easy read, it's not long, and I would recommend it just knowing what might be coming next. But these are the objectives, and what you see there is a big change. The first objective is preventing nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. And in the Nuclear Posture Review, it actually says the threat of global nuclear war has become remote. And the biggest threat today is nuclear terrorism and a nuclear attack inflicted by a nuclear terrorist act. Reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the U.S. national security strategy was the second objective. I don't need to go through these necessarily one by one, but I think you can read there and sort of see that the ordering was very important. And the final one, but still important, was sustain a safe, secure, effective nuclear deterrent arsenal for the United States. So this slide, I can give a whole briefing from Prague to Berlin because there was a whole process. The NPR came out in April of 2010, but a year before that, in April of 2009, is when President Obama introduced this vision for, eliminating Cold War thinking and reducing the role that nuclear weapons have in U.S. national security strategy and moving toward a future of leading, really, toward a future of global zero. But then, of course, he did say, as long as these weapons exist, we're going to have a safe, secure, effective deterrent for ourselves and for our allies. The New START Treaty was ratified subsequent to the NPR coming out. If this was a timeline, we could talk about it in that more linear way. But a couple of years later, after the New START Treaty was signed, so New START Treaty was on strategic arms reduction treaty with Russia. And President Obama then, a couple years later at a nuclear security summit, said the next thing we're going to do is look at tactical weapons, agreed reductions on tactical weapons, and also on non-deployed, because START Treaty was just strategic weapons that are actually deployed on delivery platforms, let's just say. And then a year later, even further, talking about an additional 1/3 fewer nuclear weapons, and also talking about tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and both reductions. So the point is, we were on a journey, we were on a path, people call it the Prague Agenda, and then when Crimea annexation happened, all of this has now just been halted. Now, it could be restarted at the appropriate time, probably not anytime soon, but it's certainly possible that it could be restarted. In the midst of all of that, we did have the New START Treaty ratified by both the U.S. Senate and the Russian Duma, and that picture is really important. That's President Obama and Medvedev signing the treaty, not Putin, right? And if you talk to Brad Roberts, I'll get to the point of the slide here in a minute, but Brad Roberts, who is at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories right now, but he was very, very involved in the New START Treaty negotiations and the Prague Agenda and the Nuclear Posture Review. He said recently that back then they couldn't think of one pathway to conflict with Russia. They couldn't think of a single pathway that would lead to an escalating conflict with Russia. And now, of course, we have a few examples of, pretty plausible scenarios of conflict with Russia. So the reason I put this in here is because New START was really a trade for modernization of the nuclear stockpile and the enterprise. I mean, the basic trade that the administration made with the Senate was you ratify New START so we can go to lower numbers, and we'll put in budget requests every year that put additional funding in for modernizing the stockpile and modernizing the infrastructure. So now we're on, and this recent letter from John McCain and I forget now who that's from, but anyway, to the president, basically refers back to that. This is a very recent letter, I think a month or so ago, saying, look, there's no question that when we ratified New START, it was because you made these agreements, so don't break the agreement. Because there is some discussion, I think the story broke in the Washington Post, it got leaked to the Post. There was some discussion about President Obama announcing some things that would cement the Prague agenda legacy of his administration. And so this was just kind of a warning about that. Okay, so this slide is a slide that I use to talk about this third era of, at least from a lab perspective, which is what I'm here to represent, this third era of U.S. nuclear weapons policy. We have the Cold War, which people are pretty familiar with. It was a very dynamic environment. We had 14 parallel nuclear weapons development programs going on at the same time. And we had no cost constraints, and it was the #1 national security concern in the country. Then in early 90s, two things happened. The Soviet Union disintegrated, and so the Cold War ended. And also we took a unilateral decision for an underground nuclear test moratorium. So we haven't ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would be, the binding multilateral treaty. But we have decided 25 years ago on a unilateral moratorium. So we entered this era, what I call the second era of nuclear weapons program for the labs. And we had really this one compelling, iconic challenge, which was to create the subcritical and above ground experimental infrastructure and the computational capabilities to simulate nuclear explosions and substitute for full up underground nuclear testing and still provide confidence in the U.S. nuclear deterrent. So we made big investments as a nation in the scientific infrastructure. But during those 20 years, the requirements for the actual stockpile itself were very unclear. And so we had a lot of development programs authorized and canceled. And in terms of the engineering environment in a place like Sandia, it was a really tough time because there was less certainty about what the mission requirements really were. People talked about a resurgent Russia and would China be a peer competitor and all of that. Okay, so then when the Nuclear Posture Review came out, it really put us on this path that we're still on today. And I think it did a genius job of bringing together both the nuclear weapons community and also the nuclear security community in kind of a shared melding of those imperatives. However, some of the needs are urgent because we went 20 to 25 years, and so we've got some aging issues, some technology obsolescence that we're trying to address. And we're in this era of fiscal austerity and uncertainty, although that's loosening up a little bit. So you can look this up, may not be all that interesting to you, but this is the schedule for modernizing the stockpile. We're literally taking each warhead type in the stockpile and we're doing a life extension program, not each, but several of them. And here's the big policy question is, how much is it going to cost? So there are all kinds of reports out there that say that the total price tag is $1 trillion, and that's a lot of money. However, President Obama and the Congress signed a $1 trillion farm bill a couple of years ago. So $1 trillion is not out of the realm of possibilities of what, a major superpower might spend on an important national issue. But I think what's going to happen is that price tag is going to moderate the pace at which we accomplish the work that we're doing to life extend the stockpile, and also at possibly the scope. Whoops. Okay, so a lot has changed since the last nuclear posture review. There may or may not be a 2017 nuclear posture review. Congress mandated it last time, and there wasn't any similar language this year, although still any incoming administration could do it on their own prerogative. I don't have to go through all of that there. We already talked about Crimea. Certainly there's been some things happening in North Korea, which are alarming. The India-Pakistan situation has been evolving and continues to evolve. And certainly China and some of the pivot to the Pacific and so on, the rebalancing to the Pacific. So, for example, here are some topics. So everybody's writing papers for the transition team right now. And here is an example list. I won't read it to you, but of the kinds of topical areas where there are options and pros and cons being studied for the next administration. And depending on, who wins, you could have a minor, riff off the current policy, or you could have a major change. But usually when people write these transition team papers, it's here's what's been the policy. One option is to continue that. One is to do, lean in a little bit more. One is to lean back a little bit more. And so these are the kinds of policy issues that people are working on for the transition team. And that's not that easy to read, but basically there are emerging threats to effective nuclear deterrence. And what we do sometimes is what we call a deep dive. So we'll look at a specific thing, let's say integrated air and missile defense systems. So U.S. nuclear weapons are about preventing war. They're not about winning war, but your deterrent threat has to be credible, and you have to be able to hold targets at risk. And one threat to holding targets at risk is the globalization and the sophistication of integrated air and missile defense systems. So that could be a deep dive that you would do. And what this is showing is that in some cases, a threat to deterrence might be addressed by some technical solution, but in other cases, you might take a policy decision to address that threat. And in even other cases on the far right, you might say, you know what, I'm not worried about this threat. Mitigation isn't warranted at this time. So I'm trying to show that part of the work we do at the labs is we're entrusted along as partners with effective deterrence. And sometimes that gets into policy space, and sometimes there are technical solutions. And so we have to be able to work across both of those. Okay, now we have a practice that we call summer studies. So I'm just going to show you 2 slides for examples of summer studies that we've done recently. Last summer, in 2015, we did a summer study on cross-domain deterrence. So one of the things one of the let's say growing areas of research now is this term cross-domain deterrence, and it's basically the fact that we have so many additional tools in our national security toolkit now to, let's say, degrade and defeat adversary capabilities like cyber attacks, supply chain attacks, space-based systems. You can just think of all the things we have now, drones and everything. And so there has been a lot of work, academic work, as well as sort of policy work associated with, historically, we've thought of a nuclear escalation ladder. And so when we've done, let's say tabletop exercises or war gaming associated with nuclear deterrence, it was always about moving up rungs on a nuclear ladder. And now what we've talked about is this has really become a lattice, an escalation lattice, where you have a lot of opportunities to move into a different domain to respond. So this is getting back, I think, to the question about strategic deterrence that came up earlier. If you had an existential attack that wasn't nuclear, but could still, demand in some people's minds a nuclear response. So the whole cross-domain thing. And so I'm not going to read that to you, but the idea of a summer study very focused on a specific sort of new, challenging policy construct. We do those kinds of things at the labs. And then this summer, we did one on rad new terrorism. And basically, we were looking at, over the horizon, what are the rapidly advancing technical capabilities? What are the changing societal constructs, and how might those lead to a totally different nuclear terrorism attack vector? And what kinds of solution space would we put in place there? I can answer questions. We can talk about those in the Q&A. So that leads me to another policy-related area that we work in. There's something called the Global Nuclear Detection Architecture. This is actually led out of the Department of Homeland Security, but in conjunction with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so it's a layered defense in-depth system that includes sensors and telecommunications and personnel, and it's really a global nuclear detection architecture. What we have created at Sandia, in conjunction with our government sponsor, is a set of training materials and this construct of milestones where any given country would start with strategy development. First, you have to take a national decision that you're going to implement a nuclear detection architecture, then you do a risk assessment, you create your own national detection strategy, and so on and so forth, all the way down to through implementation and evaluation and sustainability. And what we've been involved in my group and other groups at the lab is this education and training. So this is just an example of a course where the objective is to promote awareness of kind of the requirements and the approach to an effective detection architecture. And we've had people all over the world doing these trainer type exercises, as well as some regional studies. And we've had 75 countries so far, personnel from 75 countries so far that have been engaged in this global nuclear detection architecture training. This is a little bit notional, but the idea here, so I manage the systems analysis organization, which the term gets confused with like network systems analysis, but this is really like scoping and framing studies and risk assessment and so on. And this is a little bit notional, but the idea here is how would you prioritize and do risk assessments across all the countries in the world? And you could use you could do some quantitative risk assessments looking at things like corruption indices in each country. You could look at the extent of the nuclear infrastructure in that country and create a construct, for lack of a better term, analytic hierarchy process. And you could then score and judge and prioritize across the countries that you wanted to engage with on these types of materials. In fact, I have, we have people all over the world doing that. Now, switching to a different topic, out in Livermore, we have something called the Livermore Valley Open Campus, which is a shared construct between Sandia Livermore and Lawrence Livermore. And on my outline slide, I had the actual name for that acronym, but it is the Nuclear Energy Collaboration and Exchange, thank you. International Nuclear Energy Collaboration and Exchange. And this is just looking at the fact that the nuclear energy industry is growing and projected to grow, and that creates potential proliferation risk. A lot of it is happening in China. You've got a lot of new entrants who don't have experience with nuclear energy systems and nuclear energy infrastructure. And you've got a growing set of nuclear technology suppliers. And so for nuclear terrorism and global nuclear protection architecture, we worry a lot about nuclear energy as a potential threat vector. And what we're starting at Sandia in our Livermore Valley Open Campus is the Center of Excellence for Nuclear Energy Security Challenges. So we've got proliferation concerns. That obviously nuclear accidents are a big concern, as we saw with Fukushima. There are these new threats like cyber threats and drone attacks, and then we still haven't solved the waste disposal problem. So there's a lot to do in terms of nuclear energy safety and security. And then I think this is my last example on arms control. So I was trying to start with nuclear weapons, which I'm more familiar with and have worked in for a long time, going into some of the nuclear terrorism concerns, nuclear energy concerns, and now this is about arms control. And Tom Hickey, who was one of the NSSC students here, he spent some time at Sandia working on a framework for arms control futures. And I just have a couple of slides out of his briefing. But basically this layered approach of, so we're sort of in an era right now where specifically with Russia, the top of this layered framework really is difficult to imagine in the near term. But you can still be working these informal pathways of confidence buildings, maintaining and increasing transparency, developing what we call rules of the road as you're, wading through a period of maybe hopefully temporary pause on actual arms control constraints. I mean, some people think of arms control as, for the purpose of committing ourselves to reductions, and that's true, but we're also and primarily using arms control agreements as a way of constraining what our adversaries can do, putting relevant legal constraints on our adversaries. And so his conclusions were that, arms control can still strengthen U.S. and international security. In the near term, we're probably limited to some incremental and maybe informal even steps. Probably with Russia, we're only going to be able to, at best, preserve existing progress. I mean, I think every so often we hear about different treaties that we're accusing Russia of violating or they're accusing us of violating. With China, it's kind of a lower level, what they call more like a track 2 discussions, common interests, defining terms. And I think what's really interesting in this multilateral area is possibly working toward these rules of the road in new domains. So for example, cyber is a perfect example where we know about and we hear about Russia, China, North Korea cyber attacks on US infrastructure, but we should be having conversations about, hey, where are the lines here? There are, I think it's 17 what we call elements of our critical infrastructure, financial infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transportation, nuclear command and control. So where are the real lines and what could we agree to, even if informally, about cyber attacks as an example? So I think that's my last slide, and we've had some discussion already, but I'd like to open up the conversation even further.
questions?